Hello and welcome back to another episode. For those of you who are new here, I'm Jackie, and this podcast is designed for upper intermediate and advanced English learners. This week, I want to talk to you about the all-important topic of language learning, especially at an advanced level. It is, after all, the reason you're listening to this channel, unless of course you are really lost. And I'd like to share my favorite methods and tips that I personally use. So, without further ado, let's dive in. First off, I know most of you listening to this podcast will be intermediate or advanced English learners. This means that you've already been very successful at learning another language, and you may already have study methods and routines that work well for you. The tips and tricks I'm going to share with you guys today are just the ones that I personally use. I've likely mentioned it before, but I'm also a language learner. I figure most language teachers are language learners themselves. It's kind of our bread and butter. This idiom bread and butter means something that's fundamental or a normal, routine activity that someone specializes in. I've been fascinated by languages since I was a child, and I studied French and Spanish at school and later at university. Since then, I've spent time learning German, Italian, British Sign Language, and Japanese, and I just can't get enough. I love languages. My point is that I truly understand the highs and lows of language learning. I 100% know the feeling of elation when you've absolutely nailed it in a conversation with a native speaker and you feel at the top of the world. And I've also been there on those days when you can't seem to string 3 words together and you're ready to throw in the towel. Throw in the towel, by the way, simply means to quit and give up. This expression comes from boxing, where throwing a towel into the ring used to be used as a gesture of surrender. But we are not throwing in the towel today. No, in this episode, I want to share with you 5 main things that I try to build into my personal language learning routine, and things that I encourage my students to do. I'll throw up my hands and admit that I don't always practice what I preach. There are weeks where I am on it and I do these things regularly, and there are other weeks where it falls off the bandwagon a little, which means I've fallen out of my good routine. But I've found that when I do these 5 things in conjunction with each other over a period of time, I absolutely reap the benefits in terms of confidence, pronunciation, and fluency. You may have very well heard of many of these, and I'm certainly not trying to teach you to suck eggs. I'm not trying to teach you something you already know how to do very well. But I think we can all use a nice reminder from time to time, and I hope that you'll find these tips useful. So, tip number 1. Tip number 1 is definitely the all-encompassing tip here, and it factors into many of my other tips. Don't forget the power of comprehensible input. You've likely heard this term before, but just in case, comprehensible input is any form of reading and listening that you can understand despite not knowing all of the words or structures. This should be material that is just above your current proficiency level, so you are suitably challenged and exposed to interesting language, but it's not so difficult that you can't engage with it. Coined by linguist Stephen Krashen, the main principle is that by reading and listening to lots of suitable material, you are subconsciously absorbing and acquiring advanced language, as opposed to sitting down, memorizing lists of words or grammar rules. This podcast is a type of comprehensible input, and at your advanced level, you can also be enjoying series and films in the original English, with English subtitles if you like, listening to podcasts on a range of topics, and reading articles and books. I try to vary what I engage with. For example, I love using podcasts to practice my French. I will alternate between listening to podcasts specifically designed for advanced learners and those aimed at native speakers, such as news programs and random topics that I find interesting. Basically, listen to a lot of stuff, read a lot of stuff. You can find some of my top podcast suggestions on my website, and I recently discussed great English language literature to dive into in a recent episode, so I'll put the links in the description below. My second tip expands on my first tip, and this is all about how I personally use the material I choose as my comprehensible input, and how I follow it up with more conscious practice. I absolutely subscribe to the idea of comprehensible input, but one thing I find is that without doing a little bit of extra work, I have a hard time moving my passive knowledge into my active knowledge, meaning that I understand and recognize all of these new expressions and vocabulary that I've been presented with, but I wouldn't be able to use them myself in a conversation. I'm going to specifically talk about how I work with podcasts, but you can apply a lot of this to the other forms of comprehensible input too. First of all, I listen to a podcast episode at least twice, sometimes more. Don't be afraid of repetition. Our brains absolutely thrive on it, and you'll pick up something new during each playthrough. The first time I listen, I simply listen. No note-taking, no looking up vocabulary, no parroting. I just listen in order to enjoy the topic and glean as much of the details as I can. The verb glean means to gather something bit by bit. In this case, I'm trying to gather the main information of the episode. Then I'll listen to it a second time. Not necessarily immediately afterwards, although I sometimes do. During my second time through, I will try to have a transcript handy if it's available. This isn't absolutely necessary, but it saves some time when you can quickly identify and copy phrases with the correct spelling. As I listen, I will periodically pause and write down interesting words, phrases, and sometimes even complete sentences. I underline the key words, and this is also the point where I look up any new vocabulary or idiomatic language and make a note of them. Now, I'm personally someone who learns through writing by hand. I really enjoy note-taking, and the muscle memory that's triggered by copying out what I hear makes the language stick better in my head. If this isn't your preferred learning style, that's absolutely okay. Instead, you could print out the transcript and make notes directly on it. Once I have a page or two full of copied out words and phrases, I go back through with my highlighter and I pick out all of my favorite pieces of language. I try to select high-value items, not super specific, useful for only this one niche topic, might use this word once in a blue moon kind of thing. That wouldn't be a good use of my limited time. No, instead, I select words or phrases that are either frequently used, versatile across lots of contexts, or are terms that will help me talk about topics that I'm personally interested in and will probably want in the future. I highlight these and make them stand out on the page. But I'm not done. The third step is to do something active with this language. I often write my own sentences that use them in context. If writing isn't your favorite thing and your hand is starting to cramp at this point, you could also say some sentences out loud and record yourself if you like. I find this step really important because our brains remember phrases and expressions when we've had to use our creativity and come up with something ourselves. The final thing that I'll often do is I'll come back to the same episode a bit later on and listen again. By this point, I'm super familiar with the content. I know it pretty much like the back of my hand. I've done a deep dive into the transcript, and I've worked with many of the new phrases and vocabulary. This time, I'll focus on listening and parroting. This is something you'd ideally not do in public unless you just love it when people look at you strangely. But I'll do this at home, on a dog walk, or in my car. If you're not familiar with the term parroting, you simply do what a parrot does. You repeat back what you've heard. Doesn't have to be every sentence, doesn't even need to be the full sentence. As I listen, I just repeat the odd phrase or sentence, trying to mimic to the best of my ability the speaker's pronunciation, rhythm, and intonation. This is an invaluable exercise to do because you are training the mechanics of your mouth and slowly gaining an instinct when it comes to how the language flows and how native speakers truly sound. It's honestly great. And if you feel awkward doing it, just tell yourself it's good for you and you like it. Okay, on to tip number 3. Again, this tip builds on what we've just been talking about. You remember all those lovely new words that we highlighted and wrote sentences with? Well, we're not done with them. I honestly sometimes feel like a collector of words. The way some people feel about Pokemon cards, well, that's how I feel about words, and I just gotta collect them all. The problem is that unless you are blessed with photographic memory, and I'm not, you have to really work at remembering all these new words. And this is where a good vocabulary learning routine comes in, and this is down to personal choice. Some people love revising from vocabulary lists or physical flashcards. I do not. Instead, I love using a spaced repetition program on the internet. I won't go into the details of what a spaced repetition program is, but I did write an article all about it on my website, which I will link in the episode description. Essentially, it's a system that doesn't let your brain forget things. So I have a list of words that I continuously add to for each of the languages I'm studying, and these apps and programs turn this list into interactive revision material, flashcards, gap fills, multiple choice tests, and so on. If you get into the habit of revising for even as little as 5 minutes a day, you will eventually move this language into your long-term memory and from your passive to active vocabulary. On to tip 4. Tip 4 is maybe my favorite tip of all, and something that I've only recently started doing, so maybe I'm still enjoying the novelty of it, but I don't think so. Tip 4 is all about building fluency and improving your spoken language. If I haven't spoken a language in a while, I feel so rusty when I find myself in a lesson or in a conversation. It seems to take me ages to retrieve the word I'm looking for, and my mouth trips over my words. It's not pretty, and if you're like me, you'll know just how frustrating this is. So, what I've started doing is making sure that every single day I record myself speaking. Now, if you just died a little bit inside at the thought of recording yourself talking, don't worry, I did too. I hate the sound of my own voice, which is really ironic given that I have a podcast, but I'm a lady of contradiction. And the thought of listening to myself speaking really makes me cringe. But hear me out. You will gain so much from doing this very simple activity, and it can take as little as a couple of minutes. I often do this while I'm on a dog walk or in my car. People just assume I'm talking to someone on the phone, or they think I've lost the plot and have started talking to myself, but who cares? If I've recently done some work on a podcast episode, I will summarize what the episode was about, give my opinion about the topic, and discuss any interesting things I learned. This is another great way to use that new vocabulary with your own ideas. Sometimes, though, I don't have anything in particular I want to discuss, so I'll just talk about my day, what I've done so far, what plans I have, what are my current worries or stresses. And this might all sound quite basic, but I've actually found lots of gaps in my knowledge when talking about my daily life. For example, a couple of weeks ago, we had to get a new roof, and I was trying to talk about how the scaffolding was really ugly and I couldn't wait for it to come down. I didn't know the word for scaffolding in French at the time, so was kind of stuck. By the way, scaffolding is the temporary structure that builders will assemble in order for them to climb up to a higher point of a building. If you know this word already in English, then bravo, give yourself a pat on the back, because I've just admitted I didn't know it in French. Anyways, I see getting stuck as an opportunity. So if there's a word I suddenly don't know how to say, such as scaffolding, it doesn't matter. I'm not posting this recording anywhere. No one else but me is going to hear it. So I just say that I don't know the word, see if I can describe it in another way, or just say that one word in my native language and move on. But here is the beauty of this method. When I go back later and listen to my recording, I can take the time to look up all those words or phrases that I really wanted to know how to say. I can add them to my vocabulary list online, and I can write some sentences using them. Or I could even re-record myself with those words handy if I wanted to go the extra mile. Here is what I've found after a month of doing this. I believe I've become a more fluent speaker. With practice, I have the impression that I'm hesitating less, I'm using less filler words, the flow of my sentences feels faster and more confident, and words seem to come to mind easier and more quickly. I feel like if my language were a bicycle, then doing this self-recording exercise would be oiling the gears and making everything just work better and faster when I need it to. I highly recommend. And finally, we've reached the last and final tip, and that is to try to speak to native speakers as often as you can. I'm currently working with 2 French tutors, a Spanish tutor, and a Japanese tutor, and having that accountability to show up to each session really keeps me motivated and makes all the work I'm doing in between worth it. I can often discuss the podcast episode topics I've listened to recently, thus recycling and practicing all that good new language, and I really benefit from the corrections and feedback I receive. I fully appreciate that tutoring is a financial investment, and it may not be available for every budget. But there are free apps and websites that help you connect with people from around the world that you could do a language exchange with, and this is a fantastic free alternative. Real-life human connection is so important. Yes, you can practice vocabulary online or even chat with AI, but nothing beats speaking to another human being. That's why we're all here learning languages in the first place. It's to communicate and connect with each other. And for me, it's definitely the motivational force behind all of my other previous tips. So on that note, I'm going to wrap it up here. Thank you for listening to this episode, and I hope that I was able to give you some ideas that can refresh or enhance your language learning routine. Remember that you can access the annotated transcript for this episode on my website, JackieTeachesEnglish.com. And this is a good point to mention that if you are looking for an English tutor, I'd love to work with you and help you take your English to the next level. You can find all about the lessons I offer on my website. And finally, if you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a review on your podcast app. This really helps my podcast grow and reach other English learners like yourself. Wherever you are in the world, have a great day and keep learning. Take care.